Solaris, 1972 movie, a science fiction film made by Andrzej Tarkowski. It's a Russian film, and it's based on a Polish book by the same title by Stanisław Lem, a classic sci-fi book. And the movie follows the book quite closely. The basic premise is that there's a research station, and it's on the planet called Solaris, as in the title. The station now is past its glory days. It used to have a crew of about 80 people and it used to run research quite intensely. And now those days are long gone and only 3 people man the station. And based on recent reports, there's something worrying happening on the station. There are talks about mass hallucinations and some weird shit going on. So basically, the protagonist of the film, Chris Kelvin, he's a psychologist. He's being sent to investigate. And of course, weird things start happening. Now, before I get into the movie itself, I want to talk about sci-fi in general as a genre for a short time. So, and regardless of the medium, be it literature or film or comic book or whatever else. So I personally like to distinguish between 2 different kinds of sci-fi. What I would call low sci-fi and high sci-fi. And how I define them. Low sci-fi basically uses whatever setting it chooses to create a spectacle, but overall it's rather surface level. So think about Star Wars or MCU or Jurassic Park or Alien franchise. So these movies don't really ask deep philosophical questions. They focus more on the entertainment value. And then you have high sci-fi, which basically uses a concept to ask an interesting question. Like, what if there's alien life? Or what if machines gain sentience? Or what if human consciousness can be uploaded into a machine or the internet? And it tries to examine those questions and it's the consequences of those questions and those situations. So in this category, think about Matrix or Blade Runner or Arrival or Dune or 2001 Space Odyssey. So again, to simplify, I distinguish them like this. Low sci-fi is mostly about entertainment and high sci-fi leans towards philosophy. Now, I personally prefer the second kind, and I think that a lot of people incorrectly assume that every piece of sci-fi media has to be the former category. So I know a lot of people that do not watch science fiction movies as a rule, and I think partly because they assume incorrectly that all of those movies are basically about green aliens shooting each other with blasters, and that's not the case. So for example, you might miss out on Blade Runner because you assume that it's a movie about chasing evil robots with a gun, which, yeah, it kind of is, but not really. So it's just the setting that the movie uses to ask an interesting question and leave you thinking about it after the movie itself. So now back to the movie at hand, Solaris. So Solaris definitely falls into the latter category, as does the book that it's based upon. Now, based on the premise that I explained before, you might assume that it's a kind of horror film because we did have a lot of horror stories with that premise. A lone person arrives on a space station and weird things start happening. But it's not. It's more like a psychological drama. I'm kind of inclined to use the word thriller, but I really don't want to because it's not really that thrilling or scary. It's more, it has moments which make you feel uneasy and are kind of creepy a little bit, but it's definitely not scary in any way. And in terms of what it actually is about, I think it's difficult to summarize, which is a good sign in my book. But if I had to name a couple of main themes of the movie, I would say it's mainly about regrets and dreams and memories, especially memories, confronted with reality of today and how we process those regrets and those memories. Do we choose to relive them over and over again, whatever the cost, or do we choose to move on despite the pain that it might cause? I think this is the main philosophical dilemma between moving on from your past or clinging to it. So now, because of this summary that I just did, and because of the fact that the movie runs almost 3 hours long, you might think that there's a risk of it being boring, quite simply. And at times it is. It's partly due to Tarkovsky's style. He likes to shoot a 5 minute scene where absolutely nothing happens, and he uses that only to generate this sort of atmosphere to make you feel in a certain way. Uh, I think personally, I think it worked better in some of his other movies, but here it certainly does its job quite decently as well. And also another thing is that it adds some additional material in comparison to the book. So the book takes place exclusively on the space station. It's not a space station. It's within the atmosphere, but on the research station. Um, while the movie adds a couple of scenes, be it flashbacks or not, that happen on Earth, to kind of frame the story a little better. And what it does add is it definitely adds the contrast between the closed metal interiors of the station against the lush green environments of Earth. But on the other hand, yeah, it does slow the movie down a little bit. And those sequences, I felt like those were the places where the movie slowed down almost to a halt. And I think it suffered for a little bit for it, the tempo of the movie. Now, the immediate comparisons of this movie that I thought about were two films. One of them is called Stalker, and it's also a movie made by Tarkovsky, also a movie based on a book, and 2001 Space Odyssey, because of a similar sort of setting or premise. And I think that both of them are a little bit better in their own regard. So Stalker, I think, is better when it comes to creating this dense atmosphere, and it also handles the philosophical dilemma a little bit better. And 2001, I think it just looks miles above whatever Solaris has to offer, despite the fact that it was made, I think, 3 or 4 years before Solaris. But somehow Kubrick, made his magic work. And if you watch Space Odyssey today, it actually mostly defends itself still. So it looks like it was made yesterday in a lot of those sequences. The special effects are just on an unbelievable level. And Solaris does look dated, especially in some sequences and some scenes. However, I do think that despite all those flaws that I just mentioned, the main themes are interesting and engaging enough that the movie does stand on its own, and it works. It worked for me, and apparently it works for a lot of other people because it is considered one of the classic sci-fi movies of all time. So now the question that remains is, does it work just as this historical, interesting look into how movies were made 50 years ago, or is it still watchable, or has it aged so much that it only works as this interesting thing for movie buffs? And my answer is yes, it is still watchable. Yes, it still works as a complete whole movie. But there's a caveat to it. If you're not into sci-fi already, there are better entry points.